The first time I saw my father again, he was laughing in a way I remembered from childhood, and the sound unsettled me more than silence ever could. I realized then that time had not erased him from me. It had only taught me how to live without needing answers. I had not come back for him. That truth sat calmly inside me, neither sharp nor defensive, simply factual, like a date remembered correctly or a door left unlocked on purpose. I returned because the city had offered me something precise and temporary, a professional assignment with a defined end, a role that did not require sentiment or history, and it felt clean to accept it without attaching meaning to anything else. Cities, after all, do not belong to the people who leave them. They wait patiently, accumulating new layers, indifferent to who returns and why. The neighborhood looked smaller than memory, though not diminished, only clarified. The trees trimmed into shapes that suggested order rather than growth, the sidewalks smoothed by years of footsteps that had nothing to do with me. I walked slowly, not out of nostalgia but because I was observing myself moving through a place that had once defined me, noticing how little resistance my body felt, how easily I navigated intersections that had once seemed enormous. It struck me that familiarity does not always carry emotion. Sometimes it is simply knowledge resurfacing. I rented a modest apartment not far from my assignment, furnished enough to be functional, spare enough to remind me that this was not permanence. I unpacked with care, placing things where they would be easy to retrieve later, arranging my life as if departure were already built into it. There was comfort in that. The kind that comes from knowing exactly how much space you are willing to occupy. I did not tell my father I was back. I did not tell anyone, not because I intended secrecy, but because announcements felt unnecessary. News has a way of traveling without assistance, especially in places where familiarity lingers like dust. I assumed, correctly, that our paths would cross eventually, and I allowed that inevitability to unfold without interference. The encounter happened on a weekday afternoon, in a cafe that had replaced the old bookstore on the corner, its large windows offering visibility rather than privacy. I was seated near the back, reviewing notes, when his voice reached me before his face did, animated and warm, carrying the ease of someone comfortable being seen. I looked up without urgency, and there he was, older in the ways that suggested time had treated him gently, his posture relaxed, his expression open. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then recognition crossed his face, followed by something like relief, and finally a smile that felt practiced but sincere. He said my name as if it were an answer to a question he had not known how to ask. We greeted each other simply. No exclamations. No pauses heavy with expectation. It surprised me how natural it felt to stand there, to exchange brief pleasantries, to comment on coincidence without examining its meaning. He asked how long I was in town, and I told him the truth, giving him dates rather than explanations. He asked where I was staying, and I answered without hesitation, noticing that my voice did not change. He invited me to join him and his wife, who was seated at a table nearby, engaged in quiet conversation with someone I assumed to be a colleague. The invitation was offered without pressure, and I accepted it the same way, curious rather than cautious. When he introduced me, he did so with pride, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, a gesture that felt more symbolic than intimate, as if he were reminding himself as much as anyone else of the connection. His wife was gracious, attentive without being intrusive, her questions thoughtful, her interest measured. She did not perform warmth, she embodied it in a way that suggested confidence rather than obligation. I noted this without judgment, appreciating the clarity it provided. There is something disarming about people who do not apologize for the lives they inhabit. Conversation flowed easily, touching on work, travel, the city's changes, all the safe topics that allow people to feel connected without risk. I participated fully, offering details when asked, withholding nothing, yet volunteering little beyond what was relevant. It was not strategy, it was habit. Over time, I had learned the value of precision in personal disclosures. When we parted, my father hugged me briefly, his arms firm, his breath steady, and said we should have dinner soon. I agreed, adding nothing else. As I walked away, I felt neither satisfaction nor discomfort, only a quiet awareness that something long suspended had been set gently back into motion. Days passed, filled with work that demanded my attention in ways that felt grounding. My assignment required observation, synthesis, discretion, all skills I had refined over years of operating independently. I appreciated the structure, the expectation of clarity, the absence of emotional labor. In the evenings, I explored the city, reacquainting myself with its rhythms, noting what had shifted and what remained stubbornly the same. Dinner was scheduled without drama, set for a Sunday evening at their home, a house I had never lived in, located in a neighborhood I had once associated with ambition rather than belonging. When I arrived, the space felt carefully curated, comfortable without being indulgent, each object placed with intention. It was a home designed to reflect stability, and it succeeded. The meal unfolded smoothly. My father spoke with ease, his stories punctuated by laughter, his wife contributing observations that revealed shared history. I listened, asked questions when appropriate, responded when addressed, feeling no urge to insert myself into narratives that had unfolded without me. There was no exclusion in this. It was simply chronology. Their child joined us briefly, polite, observant, possessing a quiet confidence that comes from consistency. I recognized something familiar in the way they watched me, not suspicion, but curiosity, the kind that seeks orientation rather than judgment. We exchanged small talk, neutral and kind, and I felt a subtle shift at the table, as if an additional dimension had been acknowledged without being named. After dinner, my father offered to walk me to my car. Outside, the evening air was cool, the streetlights casting even pools of light along the sidewalk. He spoke about the city, about work, about how good it was to see me, his tone earnest, unguarded. I responded honestly, agreeing where agreement was appropriate, listening without filling silences unnecessarily. He did not ask why I had returned. I did not offer reasons. There was a shared understanding, unspoken but clear, that explanations are not always invitations to closeness. Sometimes they are simply noise. As I drove away, I considered the ease of the evening, the absence of tension, the way everything had aligned into something almost peaceful. It would have been easy, in that moment, to misinterpret this calm as resolution, to assume that time had done its work and that the past had settled into something manageable. But calm is not the same as closure. And peace, I had learned, is often just the surface condition of deeper currents. I returned to my apartment, removed my shoes, and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights, feeling neither triumphant nor unsettled. I was exactly where I intended to be, occupying space that belonged to no one else, carrying nothing that required confession or forgiveness. I had not come back to reclaim anything. I had come back because this was the one place where my presence could exist without explanation, and that, I understood now, was enough to change everything. And still, nothing felt like it had begun. If part 1 marked my return, part 2 was where my presence began to register, not as interruption but as permanence that refused to announce itself. I did not insert myself into my father's life. I allowed him to notice that I was already there, moving through shared spaces with an ease that did not ask permission or forgiveness. That distinction mattered more than he understood. Dinner became a pattern rather than an event, sometimes at their house, sometimes in restaurants chosen for convenience rather than sentiment, and occasionally in places I selected, not to assert control but to establish reciprocity. I did not perform gratitude for inclusion, nor did I behave as if I were testing the ground beneath me. I arrived on time, engaged fully, and left when the evening concluded, carrying nothing home that required interpretation. What unsettled them was not my composure but the absence of visible need. I did not lean forward when my father spoke, seeking approval or validation. I did not compare myself to his wife or adjust my presence around her. I did not soften my opinions to maintain harmony. I was polite, measured, and complete, and in families, completeness is often more disruptive than defiance. His wife began to watch me more closely, not with suspicion, but with calculation, as if trying to understand what role I intended to play. I gave her none. We spoke easily, sharing observations about work, about the city, about things that did not require alignment or opposition. She was intelligent, perceptive, and used to managing social equilibrium, and I sensed that my neutrality unsettled her because it could not be negotiated with. My father, meanwhile, began to volunteer details about his life that I had not requested, offering explanations framed as context rather than defense. He spoke of career decisions, of timing, of circumstances that had shaped his choices, his voice steady, his eyes searching my face for response. I listened carefully, neither affirming nor challenging his narrative, allowing it to exist as his alone. Silence, I had learned, is not empty. It is reflective. And the longer I allowed his words to hang without resolution, the more he filled the space himself. Outside of these dinners, my life expanded quietly. I reconnected with extended family members not out of obligation but curiosity, attending gatherings where my presence was greeted with warmth and surprise. No one asked questions directly. They did not need to. The mere fact of my return carried its own implications, and I let them form conclusions without correction. Familiar faces adjusted to me as I was now, not as they remembered me, and that recalibration happened without ceremony. What struck me most was how easily I fit back into the social fabric without effort. I did not need to explain where I had been or why I had left. People accepted my return as they accept most things that arrive calmly, without spectacle. It was my father who struggled with this ease, who noticed that my reintegration did not revolve around him, that my life here did not depend on his acknowledgement. He began to invite me to events, professional gatherings, informal get-togethers with colleagues and neighbors, extending inclusion as if it were a bridge he hoped would close a distance he could no longer measure. I accepted selectively, not to punish, but to preserve balance. At these events, I observed how others perceived him, how his confidence manifested, how his reputation functioned independently of our history. People spoke to me with interest, sometimes with admiration, commenting on my work, my composure, the way I articulated ideas. I noticed my father listening closely during these moments, his attention sharpening, his posture shifting as if recalibrating his understanding of who I had become. It was not pride that crossed his face, but something more complex, a recognition that arrived too late to shape. The half-sibling appeared more frequently during this period, their presence no longer incidental but intentional. They asked questions about my work, my travels, my interests, their curiosity genuine and unguarded. I answered honestly, offering details without embellishment, aware that they were mapping possibilities rather than seeking comparison. Still, comparison emerged naturally, not through words but through observation, through the quiet process of alignment and differentiation that siblings undertake instinctively. I did not encourage closeness, nor did I resist it. I treated them as an equal, not as a symbol, and that seemed to unsettle my father more than any overt claim ever could. He watched our interactions with a careful attention, as if measuring something intangible, perhaps realizing that relationships formed without intention can carry more weight than those pursued deliberately. At work, my assignment progressed steadily, demanding focus and precision. The clarity of my professional life contrasted sharply with the emotional undercurrents of my personal one, and I found solace in that distinction. My colleagues knew nothing of my family history, and I preferred it that way. Identity, I believed, should be contextual, not cumulative. Occasionally, my father would ask how long I planned to stay, framing the question casually, but the frequency of it betrayed an underlying unease. I answered consistently, referencing my contract, my obligations, my plans, none of which included him. This was not avoidance, it was accuracy. The truth does not always soothe. What began to surface during this time was a subtle shift in the family dynamic, not dramatic enough to name but impossible to ignore. Conversations grew more careful. Assumptions were reconsidered. My presence introduced a variable that could not be simplified or absorbed without consequence. I did not challenge the existing structure, but I occupied space within it that had previously been empty, and emptiness, once filled, alters balance. One evening, after a particularly long dinner that lingered past comfort, my father walked me out again, his movements slower, his voice quieter. He spoke of time, of how quickly it passes, of how strange it is to see one's child as an adult. I listened, acknowledging the observation without extrapolation. He paused, as if waiting for something more, and when it did not come, he continued walking. I realized then that what he was seeking was not forgiveness or absolution, but confirmation that his absence had not mattered as much as he feared. I could not give him that, not because it was untrue, but because it was not mine to offer. The impact of a choice is not mitigated by later understanding. When I returned home that night, I sat at my desk and reviewed my schedule for the coming weeks, noting deadlines, meetings, obligations that anchored me firmly in the present. I felt no urgency to resolve anything, no desire to accelerate what was unfolding. This was not a confrontation to be staged or a reckoning to be forced. It was a recalibration in progress, driven by proximity rather than intention. I understood then that reclaiming space does not require demand. It requires consistency. The kind that allows others to adjust themselves around you, to recognize that you are not there to take something back, but to exist fully, unapologetically, in a place that once defined you. And in that recognition, the consequences had already begun, not loudly, not visibly, but with a permanence that could not be undone. By the time comparison entered the room, it did so without invitation, slipping into conversations the way temperature changes do, unnoticed at first, undeniable once acknowledged. I did not introduce it. I did not resist it. I simply continued to exist as I was, and that was enough. It began with casual remarks, offered by people who believed themselves neutral, observations framed as compliments that carried no apparent weight until they accumulated. Someone commented on how my father and I spoke with similar precision, another noted the resemblance in how we listened before responding, and a colleague of his remarked, with genuine surprise, that my work ethic mirrored his in ways that felt uncanny. Each comment landed softly, but together they formed a pattern that my father could not ignore. I noticed how he grew quieter in these moments, how his smile held a fraction longer than necessary, how his gaze shifted between me and the speaker as if recalibrating a mental image that no longer aligned with his assumptions. It was not jealousy that unsettled him, nor regret in its conventional form, but a dawning awareness that the version of me he had imagined during his absence was incomplete, perhaps even comforting in its limitation. At home, dynamics shifted subtly. His wife became more attentive to the spaces I occupied, not territorial, but alert, as if monitoring the balance of something she had long taken for granted. We continued to speak easily, but our conversations acquired an additional layer, a mutual recognition that families are ecosystems, and any new presence alters the environment, regardless of intent. The half-sibling, meanwhile, grew bolder in their curiosity. Our conversations extended beyond pleasantries into discussions about choices, about independence, about what it means to define oneself outside of expectation. They listened intently, absorbing not advice but perspective, and I was careful to speak only from my own experience, never positioning it as a template or a critique. Still, influence is not always deliberate, and I sensed my father observing these exchanges with a mixture of pride and unease. One afternoon, the half-sibling asked me directly what it had been like to grow up without our father present. The question was not accusatory, nor was it naive. It was framed with a careful neutrality that suggested a genuine desire to understand rather than to judge. I paused, considering the weight of my response, aware that any answer would resonate beyond the moment. I told them the truth, stripped of drama or embellishment. I said it had been instructive. I said it had taught me self-reliance early, had clarified my priorities, had shaped my understanding of commitment and absence. I did not describe pain or loss. I did not offer a narrative of resilience or triumph. I simply stated facts, allowing them to exist without interpretation. The silence that followed was thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. The half-sibling nodded, absorbing this information with a seriousness that suggested it would not be easily forgotten. My father, who had been within earshot, remained still, his expression unreadable, as if he were processing data that challenged a long-held assumption. Later, he approached me privately, his tone cautious, his words chosen with care. He asked whether I felt disadvantaged by his absence, framing the question as concern rather than guilt. I considered my answer carefully, not because it was difficult, but because it was precise. I told him that disadvantage is a relative concept, that absence had forced adaptation, and adaptation had yielded clarity. I did not soften the statement. I did not sharpen it either. He nodded, accepting the response, but I could see that it unsettled him. The notion that his absence had not crippled me, that it had instead produced someone he did not fully recognize, was more disorienting than any accusation could have been. It suggested that his role in my life had been less central than he had imagined, and that realization carried its own quiet devastation. As weeks passed, this pattern repeated itself in various forms. People sought my opinion, my perspective, my participation, not because of my connection to him, but because of who I was independently. Invitations arrived directly to me. Conversations unfolded without reference to my father, and I navigated them with ease, neither emphasizing nor obscuring our relationship. My mother, during this time, remained a steady presence, her demeanor unchanged, her engagement with my return measured and calm. We spent time together without revisiting the past, sharing meals, attending events, existing side by side with an understanding that did not require articulation. She did not frame herself as a survivor or a victim. She spoke of her life as it was now, full and autonomous, shaped by choices made in response to circumstances rather than defined by them. It was through her, indirectly, that my father began to understand the full scope of what he had left behind. Not a broken household or a life in need of repair, but a parallel existence that had evolved without him, complete and self-sustaining. This realization did not arrive as a revelation, but as a gradual erosion of certainty, a slow dismantling of the narrative that had allowed him to move forward unencumbered. One evening, after a gathering that left him unusually withdrawn, my father admitted, almost to himself, that he felt as though he were meeting me for the first time. The statement was not an apology or a confession. It was an observation, tinged with something like grief. I acknowledged it without comment, understanding that recognition does not always lead to resolution. In that moment, I saw clearly that the consequences he was facing were not imposed by me, but by the reality of who I had become. My existence, fully realized and unapologetic, challenged the version of events he had relied upon to justify his choices. It forced him to confront the cost of absence, not in terms of suffering inflicted, but in opportunities forfeited. I felt no triumph in this. Revenge, as I understood it, was not about inflicting pain, but about restoring balance. About allowing truth to surface naturally, without distortion or embellishment. And the truth was simple. His decision had shaped us both in ways that could not be reconciled by proximity alone. As I left his house that night, the air cool and still, I recognized that the most profound shifts often occur quietly, beneath the surface, unnoticed until they have already taken hold. Comparison, once introduced, cannot be undone. It lingers, informing perception, reshaping understanding, altering relationships in ways that resist resolution. And in that lingering, the consequences continued to unfold, steady and irreversible, without a single word needing to be spoken. By the time I understood that silence had done all the work it could, I also understood that what remained was not confrontation but clarification. There are moments when restraint reaches its natural limit, not because one loses control, but because truth, once fully formed, demands articulation in order to settle. I did not feel compelled to speak. I felt ready. The setting was unremarkable, which felt appropriate. We were not gathered for an announcement or a reckoning. It was an afternoon that had unfolded without intention, one of those days that arrives already tired, its light muted, its pace unhurried. My father and I sat across from each other in his study, a room designed to suggest thoughtfulness, its shelves carefully curated, its surfaces uncluttered, as if order itself were a form of reassurance. He had asked me to stay after lunch, his tone casual, his posture composed, but there was a tension beneath it, a sense of something pending. I recognized it not as anxiety, but as anticipation, the kind that follows prolonged uncertainty. He wanted resolution, though he did not yet understand what form it would take. We spoke first about ordinary things. My work. His schedule. The city. Words moved easily between us, familiar and uncharged, but I noticed how he watched me, his attention sharpened, as if waiting for a signal he could not name. Eventually, the conversation slowed, settling into a pause that felt intentional rather than awkward. He broke the silence by saying that he had been thinking a great deal about the past. The statement was offered carefully, without accusation or defense, as though he were testing its weight before committing to it. I nodded, acknowledging the sentiment without encouraging elaboration. He continued, speaking about choices, about timing, about how people make decisions believing they are acting in the best interest of everyone involved. He did not justify himself directly, but the implication was clear. He was seeking understanding, perhaps absolution, though he did not frame it that way. His voice remained steady, but there was an undercurrent of vulnerability that I had not heard before. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly, his gaze searching for confirmation that his reflections had landed where he hoped they would. It was then that I realized the moment had arrived, not because he had earned it, but because withholding any longer would have shifted the balance from restraint to evasion. I told him that there was something he needed to understand, not about him, but about me. I spoke calmly, without preamble, my words measured, my tone even. I did not accuse. I did not dramatize. I simply began. I said that when he left, I was old enough to understand what absence meant, but too young to articulate its implications. I said that I did not experience his departure as a singular wound, but as a structural change, something that required immediate adaptation rather than emotional processing. I explained that children do not always grieve in recognizable ways. Sometimes they reorganize. I told him that very early on, I made a decision, though at the time I would not have called it that. I decided that reliance was a liability. Not because people are untrustworthy by nature, but because circumstances are indifferent. I learned to anticipate loss not with fear, but with preparation. This was the secret I had never spoken aloud, not to my mother, not to anyone else, because it was not born of pain, but of clarity. I did not grow up longing for his return. I grew up learning how not to need it. As I spoke, I watched his expression change, not dramatically, but incrementally, each realization settling into place with a weight that could not be deflected. I told him that I did not feel abandoned in the way people imagine abandonment, as devastation or rupture. I felt instructed. His absence taught me what to expect, and more importantly, what not to. I explained that this understanding shaped every relationship I formed thereafter. I chose independence reflexively. I avoided entanglements that required negotiation of power or dependency. I valued self-sufficiency not as a virtue, but as a necessity. This was not resilience in the romantic sense. It was architecture. I said that the darkest part of this truth, the part one had never named because it did not feel like something that needed absolution, was that I did not miss him. Not in the way he might have imagined. I did not sit with longing or unanswered questions. I simply adjusted, and in that adjustment, I became someone who did not require completion from anyone else. The room felt very still as I finished. My father did not interrupt, did not protest, did not attempt to reframe what I had said. He remained silent, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond me, as though recalculating an equation whose variables had shifted irreversibly. After a long moment, he asked quietly whether that meant I felt nothing for him now. The question was not defensive, it was tentative, almost fragile. I considered it carefully, aware of its significance. I told him that affection and dependence are not the same thing. I said that I respected him, that I valued our current interactions, that I bore him no resentment. But I also said that the role he once occupied in my life no longer existed, not because it had been taken from him, but because it had dissolved in his absence. This was the consequence he had not anticipated. Not anger. Not estrangement. But obsolescence. He leaned back in his chair, his composure finally giving way to something like grief, though it was not loud or performative. It was contained, internal, the kind that settles slowly and stays. I realized then that he had always believed his departure would define me, that it would leave a mark he could later return to and address. He had not considered the possibility that it would instead redefine him. When I stood to leave, there was no dramatic exchange, no closing statement. He thanked me for my honesty, his voice subdued, his eyes tired. I acknowledged the sentiment and gathered my things, feeling neither relief nor regret. As I stepped outside, the air felt cooler, clearer, as if something long held had finally been released. I understood that this conversation was not the end, but it was the fulcrum, the point at which everything that followed would be informed by what had been revealed. The darkest secret was not that I had been hurt. It was that I had been transformed in ways that left no room for reconciliation as he had imagined it. And in that truth, the final shape of the consequences became inevitable. After that afternoon, nothing dramatic happened, which I understood was precisely the point. Lives rarely fracture in visible ways. They recalibrate quietly, adjusting around truths once spoken aloud. The revelation did not end our contact, nor did it intensify it. Instead, it clarified the boundaries that had always existed, rendering them visible at last. My father did not withdraw from me, but he changed. His conversations grew more deliberate, his questions fewer and more considered. He no longer attempted to explain himself or contextualize his past choices. The narrative he had once rehearsed for years had lost its audience, and without resistance to push against, it collapsed under its own weight. He listened more than he spoke now, not out of strategy, but because he had finally understood that listening would not restore what had passed. His wife sensed the shift almost immediately. She did not ask me what had been said, nor did she seek reassurance. Instead, she adjusted her interactions with a careful neutrality that suggested respect rather than caution. There was no rivalry, no tension that needed naming. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that this was not a conflict to be managed, but a truth to be accommodated. In families built on second chapters, the past does not disappear, it waits. The half-sibling became quieter around me, not distant, but thoughtful. Our conversations continued, though their tone changed, acquiring a seriousness that had not been there before. I recognized in them the early stages of a reckoning not yet articulated, the awareness that family history is not linear, that inheritance includes absence as much as presence. I did not guide them through it. I did not need to. Everyone arrives at understanding in their own time. As for my mother, she received the aftermath without surprise. When I told her, briefly and without detail, that I had finally said what I needed to say, she nodded, neither relieved nor concerned. She had never waited for this moment. Her life had not been paused pending resolution. That, too, was a consequence my father had not fully grasped until now, that the women he left behind had continued without him, not defiantly, but competently. My assignment reached its natural conclusion shortly after. The work wrapped cleanly, the kind of ending professionals appreciate because it leaves nothing unresolved. I began to pack my apartment with the same methodical care I had used when I arrived, returning objects to their places, reducing my presence back into portability. Departure, for me, had always been easier than arrival. My father asked when I was leaving, his tone steady, his posture composed. I gave him a date. He asked if we would see each other again. I told him the truth, which was that we likely would, though not often, and not in ways that would alter what had already been established. He nodded, accepting this without protest, and for the first time, I sensed that he understood the permanence of what he had lost, not access to me, but relevance in shaping who I was. On my final evening, we shared a quiet meal, just the two of us. There was no ceremony, no attempt at nostalgia. We spoke about the present, about logistics, about things that could be addressed without implication. When the meal ended, he walked me to my car one last time, the street familiar now in a way it had not been weeks earlier. He said that he was proud of me. The statement was offered plainly, without expectation of response. I thanked him, equally plain, neither dismissing nor elevating the sentiment. Pride, I had learned, is most useful when it arrives without conditions, even if it arrives late. Before I left, he said something that surprised me. He said that he had always believed leaving had been an act of courage, a difficult choice made in pursuit of happiness. He paused, then added that he now understood it had also been an abdication, one whose cost he would continue to pay quietly for the rest of his life. I did not correct him. I did not soften the implication. I simply acknowledged the statement, because it was accurate, and accuracy, at this stage, mattered more than comfort. I drove away without looking back, not out of bitterness, but because there was nothing left behind that required vigilance. The city receded in my mirrors, its lights blending into a familiar blur, and I felt the calm that comes from completion rather than escape. The revenge, if it could be called that, was never about humiliation or exposure. It was about presence. About allowing my father to see, fully and unmistakably, the outcome of a choice he had once framed as necessary. I did not punish him. I did not deprive him of anything he had not already surrendered. I simply removed the illusion that time had softened the consequences. He would continue his life respected, comfortable, surrounded by family. Nothing had been taken from him. And yet, something essential was gone forever, the certainty that he had mattered in the ways he once assumed. He would carry that knowledge privately, without spectacle, understanding at last that love does not erase responsibility, and absence, once normalized, cannot be undone. As for me, I left complete. Not healed, because there had been nothing to heal, but clarified. I had returned, occupied the space that once defined me, and left again without residue. The cycle closed cleanly, not with forgiveness or reconciliation, but with truth fully integrated into the present. Families, I had learned, are not destroyed by abandonment. They are reshaped by it. And sometimes, the most lasting consequences are not dramatic, but enduring, lived quietly by those who believed they had moved on unscathed. I did not come back to reclaim him. I came back to make sure he finally understood that he never owned what he left behind. And when I left, for the last time, the story ended exactly where it needed to, with nothing unresolved, nothing owed, and nothing left to return for.